We now have two interpretations to the same 11 lines. One interpretation you might call the Greek. The other interpretation we can call the Mycenaean. Now, the Mycenaean interpretation is going to be the second quarter emotional interpretation, the one where we have turned back from Agamemnon's name and we have pushed away the Ledean myth to reveal the biography, the story of the horse and the soldiers and the emblems of the colonization. And then the first quarter interpretation, that of the Greek, is the myth of Leda and the Swan. Misunderstood. It is the swan raping the women and giving birth to these three individuals who somehow become extremely successful in society. By having these two civilizations side by side, like we do here, the Mycenaean and the Greek civilization rising out of the ruins of the Mycenaean long after it had fallen, it provides or suggests a timeline. You see, W.B. Yeats was known to refer to history in its 2,000-year cycles. And he wasn't alone in this, and he isn't alone even today. There has been an idea within our society that believes that every 2,000 years, civilization flips. That for 1,000 years, a civilization will rise, and then it'll peak psychologically. Psychological development of the people at capacity will peak, and then for 1,000 years it will fall, and then for 1,000 years it will rise again. And this rise and fall, this time period, the Mycenaeans and the Greeks, can be inferred from the poem itself. For the Mycenaean version is of 1,000 years, from 2000 BC to 1000 BC. And roughly, and to be understood that when speaking about the rise and fall of civilizations and these cosmic time frames that ascribe to them, like for instance 2,000 years, these numbers are not very exact. You have to sort of give some room for life itself to move faster or slower than previous millennia. And so the Battle of Troy happened at roughly 1100 BC, but we can say 1000 for the sake of the argument. So Mycenaean civilization rose for 1,000 years until it peaked when it colonized Troy. And from there, scholars and archaeologists, they still wonder what happened to this great civilization and where it went. How, with runes so magnificent in rune that they, of anyone, could have fallen from their height. And then the Greeks rose out of that, yet they didn't understand the language. They didn't understand the myths, the accounts, the records. And so they brainwashed themselves by misreading the records of another people and paying reverence to those records and to their runes because of how apparent their superiority once was, and psychologically still was. And they do that for 1,000 years, from 1000 BC down to 0, otherwise known as 1 AD. And then the Greeks fall. And that's a 2,000-year cyclical cycle of civilization. Yeats also believed that our current age began at 0 or 1 AD and then grew in achievement for 1,000 years up until the point that Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople, up until the point that that civilization had reached its height during the early Middle Ages and then disappeared from the map, essentially, very much like we had seen with Troy, Greece, or any of the other ancient civilizations. They sort of reach a point, and in many cases, for unexplainable reasons, we find their ruins today in chaos, strewn about as if, in some cases, people left in a hurry. And so then from 1000 AD to 2000 AD, he says that society dropped from its peak, and that somewhere between 2000 and 2100 AD is the beginning to the New Age. Because you see these 2,000-year cycles, 1,000 year up, 1,000 years down. These cycles are said to repeat themselves over and over throughout history. This 2,000-year cycle, essentially, a good way to think about it, is that it is the psychological maturing of a society. That a society itself, as a whole, as a unit, will develop psychologically, and that it peaks after 1,000 years of progress, and it reaches some limit that isn't exactly known or defined, not at least in the literature that I have read. And then at that peak, everything disassembles and slowly begins its 1,000-year journey down before calling on the New Age to rise back up for the next 2,000 years. This philosophy, this rising and falling of civilizations, is the bread and butter of Yeats' philosophy. Now, it's time for us to get into the third quarter intellectual interpretation. The interpretation that must be themed, highly functional. Intellectual means of the mind. So this interpretation is supposed to be clearly made of the mind and dealing with very high-minded ideas. Now, the third quarter interpretation comes out of what I call the backstop, which is the 3.5 final lines of the poem. And they read, "Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood in the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop." Now again, as stated earlier, I call this portion of the poem the backstop, because if a reader drops into it without first reframing Agamemnon's name and then hopefully pushing the lines back to reframe more and more, if the reader drops into this section without first doing that, it acts as a backstop. And what's even more is that Yeats gapped it, not only with a line break, but he started the next half line almost an indent mark further than where the previous line terminates. It's a very interesting thing. I'm not quite sure why he did this, and the arguments are endless, I suppose, but it's always important to take a look at his choices and the formation of the latter half of this poem, the line break, the indent when he restarts the next line. All these are conscious choices that W.B. Yeats made while writing this sonnet. So they're all important to consider and weigh and at least hold in our heads as we walk through the rest of this poem. And so with that said, it's time to jump into W.B. Yeats's philosophy contained within his work, A Vision, 1925 edition. In all the previous interpretations, there has been something that pointed itself out to us. For instance, Agamemnon's name was like the lifesaver as we attempted to interpret the passage. Now, similarly, in the backstop, in the last 3.5 lines of the poem, we must search for other cues to help us orientate ourselves with what's going on here. And it is rife with cues. The intellectual interpretation is discovered within the backstop when one sees and accumulates the words she, power, and knowledge. Did she put on his power with his knowledge before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Now, what could that mean? More importantly, what could it mean in the context of Yeats' philosophy, A Vision? Did those words, either singularly or in a group, she, knowledge, power, do those mean anything for Yeats' philosophy? I think so. And although the terms knowledge and power sort of stand out more here than the pronoun she, I think it's worth taking the pronoun and addressing it first. Because who is this woman? Who is this feminine element here in the backstop? A look into his philosophy provides the answer. You see, as Yeats describes it, the only feminine element within his philosophy is the daemon. The daemon is a personal, unconscious element of our minds. It may work against or with your personality. One may even call it one's own animal nature. This would sort of be belittling. Essentially, the daemon is the soul's energy, its natural energy given by life. James Flannery describes the daemon of Yeats quite acutely in his book, W.B. Yeats and the Idea of the Theater. And there he said, "The idea of the daemon as a personal emissary from the supernatural world existing within the unconscious mind is originally derived from ancient Greece, where the daemonic was understood as the intermediary between the gods and men. From Homeric times, the Greeks attributed all events or actions which were not within man's conscious control to the intervention of daemonic
or godlike forces. Daemon was, in fact, up to the 15th century, a word that could be used interchangeably with theos, meaning God. By the 5th century, however, a new belief arose which associated the daemon with certain seemingly supernatural powers innate in man himself. The daemonic was thought of as the occult self or soul of man that persisted through several incarnations and was the carrier of man's potential divinity and guilt.
Truth be told, the daemon has a long history with humanity. And as Flannery pointed out, up to the 5th century AD, the daemon was thought to be, up to the 5th century AD, the daemon was thought to be working in conjunction with the person. Now, this relationship is not always friendly. No, in fact, it depends what state you are in on the great wheel. What quarter does your spiritual level of progress put you in? And so, for instance, if your spirit level is within the first 7 phases, then you fall into the carnal and physical fight that quarter entails on everybody within it. And what that means is a person of this quarter, the first one, will more often than not have to face the carnality and the temptation of the physical world. Whereas someone who is in phase 8 to 14 per se, the second quarter, that person will be tempted most by emotional reactions and disturbances, and so on and so forth until you get to the end of the phases. How one interacts with his or her daemon is very important, because you see, in one sense, the daemon will test you at every turn. It will try to get you to follow your temptations. It will push you in the wrong direction in some cases, not because it is wicked. It's force, however you define that force within you. It is challenging you. And that is what the daemon does. That is what the daemon does. It challenges you. It picks a fight with you. And you must fight back against it. You see, the daemon is the only enemy you'll ever need in life, because it is in your own mind. And if you resist its temptations, then spiritually, you will grow from one phase to the next, from one quarter to the other, on this path of enlightenment. But it takes you to face the fight of your own inner temptations, not because you're there to deny them outright, but because they are the tasks that your soul gives you to strengthen your resolve against evil in the world and find the path of enlightenment. Now, although the daemon is one of the biggest pieces of Yeats' philosophy. There are a number of others that we need to cover. One being the will. Yeats is big on the will. The will to do something, the will to build something, the will to act, willpower. Will is a big part of his philosophy, because a person must develop this willpower to act before they can go about changing anything. For instance, if you feel yourself in temptation of the daemon, you must have the willpower to resist, to act against it, to get anywhere. And this willpower develops, it strengthens, or weakens, depending on the phase you find yourself within. Not everybody has the same willpower, and it's because not everybody has developed it in the same way. And some people will continue to develop it and strengthen it, and others, without a philosophy to think about or to be guided by, others won't. And they will have no willpower. Third element of W.B. Yeats's philosophy is the mask. Now, the mask is a very interesting thing, because the mask is what W.B. Yeats says we all put on. That as people, we aspire to be greater people, and that we look to the role model we are seeking. We make a mask of what we think we would be at that level, at that stage, at that place, and we wear that mask. And the mask sometimes looks nothing like ourselves. Indeed, it is another person we are trying to become. And so the mask is a pivotal element within Yeats's philosophy, because a person has to sometimes be someone else. And sometimes when you're growing, you'll recognize that turning into someone new is just another process of growth. The expression comes to mind, fake it till you make it. I think that's most appropriate. Sometimes it can be used disparagingly. People take that statement and say, oh man, you're not the real thing, you're just faking it. But it's natural in life to fake at something before we become it. You sort of have to play at it. You have to get yourself accustomed to speaking and moving and acting in a new way. And that's a process. And it's a process that we undergo while wearing a mask that we have designed and decided to wear. A new personality that we're trying to conform to for whatever reason. And so every task requires a new mask, a new person to achieve this new thing. The fourth important element of Yeats' system is called creative mind. And it's very important to sort of hold these things all together, because they do function as a whole. The daemon, the will, the mask, and now the creative mind. And then the final element, which is the body of fate. Now I'm going to discuss the creative mind and the body of fate at the same time, because they're rather similar. Now the creative mind is all the things outside of you that you can rely on to make a crucial decision. It is a bank of knowledge swirling throughout our people and throughout our society and our culture that you can depend on to complete a task. Now, this information is not just contained in a book per se, or even, on someone's tongue somewhere as they recite it. The creative mind, I think Carl Jung would probably describe it best, is more an unconscious memory that is within us from birth. That there is a store bank of information that is handed to us in our genes. Now this sounds all a bit mystical, right? A bit magical. And it's the same thing that Carl Jung thought. This was a bit magical, a bit mystical. And so his predecessor, Joseph Campbell, also must have thought the same thing. Wow, this is a bit magical. Can we prove it? Can we show people that this is real? Now, proving such a thing, there is a memory bank of information that humans are born with, is a much harder task than you might think. But let me tell you about the phenomenal example that Joseph Campbell gave to the world to prove that, at least in some species, information and images are handed down through genetics. So Joseph Campbell's case study comes from an island in the tropics that had sea turtles that would come up onto the beach and nest, lay their eggs, and go back out to sea. Somewhere along the line, some biologist realized that when these sea turtles hatch and they come out of their eggs onto the sand for the first time, they were exceptionally exposed to birds of prey. Birds would fly up and down the beach. Every once in a while, they'd swoop down and snatch up one of these baby sea turtles, have it for dinner, breakfast, you name it. It was a 24/7 buffet. Now, these sea turtles, however, would come out of the sand and somehow know what bird is a bird of prey and what bird is not. And so again, here's a sea turtle, fresh out of its egg. No parent around to be seen. Sea turtles birth alone, out of an egg, run to the sea. Here's this brand new baby sea turtle. Comes out of its egg onto the sand and it looks up. And it sees a bird of prey flying. So it scurries. Similarly, another turtle comes out of its egg, climbs onto the sand, looks up, and sees a bird. But it's not a bird of prey. So the sea turtle doesn't run at all. Which begs the question, how'd the second sea turtle know that that bird wasn't a threat? As scientists and biologists watching this unfold, it's very easy for us to see what types of birds they are. But how could this baby newborn turtle know? Well, maybe it didn't know, right? And so further research was needed. So this is what they did. They put a wire up along the beach, along the shore, long wire. And they got some taxidermy birds. One was a bird of prey, another was not. And they put that bird of prey on the wire and they waited for turtles to come out of their eggs. And they sent it flying. And as soon as the turtles, all of them, seen it, they scattered, as expected, which was interesting. So then the researchers, they took the bird that was not a bird of prey, harmless bird of the area, they put it on the wire. They sent it down the beach. And when the turtles looked up and saw it, Nothing happened. No reaction. Just went about their business. So then the researchers said, wow, well, this is really something. Do they have an image of these birds already within their heads before they're born? How do they know what bird is a bird of prey and which one is not? And so the researchers then got a little clever. They took the bird of prey and they turned him around so that when the turtles looked up, it would appear as if he were flying backwards, therefore sort of changing the shape of his forward trajectory, changing the image. And an amazing thing happened. When they turned the bird around and sent it flying over the beach backwards, the turtles looked up and they didn't move. They just went about their business. And what this suggested to the researchers is not only do the turtles have the image of birds, different birds, classified within their minds already, they have these images classified with forward movement so that the image is only correct if it's moving in the right orientation. And if it's in the wrong orientation, then it's a different image entirely. And the turtles perceive this, intuitively, of course. But by suggesting that the turtles, or proving that the turtles are born with this bank of images and this sort of extra knowledge that came from life itself, we're better able to understand what the creative mind is to humanity and how we ourselves are also born with these innate things, these things that just come from the very beginning. For instance, many of you may have heard that when a baby is born, it naturally knows how to swim. It knows to kick its feet, to turn over on its back, float. Nobody teaches a baby that. That comes naturally. So there are things like that go to prove or support the idea of the creative mind within us all, or of this collective, unconscious, this memory bank of ideas and experiences and archetypes that we're all born with. Now, the last and final element of Yeats' philosophy is the body of fate. Now, the body of fate is a very interesting thing. And it's important here to make the distinction between fate and destiny. For destiny is the path that you choose. And fate is the path that you're just given without any willpower, without, the will to fight for something different or better. Fate is just what life hands you. Destiny is what you go get from life. And so the body of fate tends to be the outer world that is affecting a person at any given time. And it's not just the outer world, it's the circumstances that you find yourself within. And it may be that you're born in the 21st century. It may be that you're a Caucasian man. Maybe that you're 5'11", you have dark brown hair. These things are your fate. Those things, that listing is my body of fate. These are the things that I cannot get away from when coming into this life. But you must always remember that your body of fate is not a condemnation. It is not a punishment. In many respects, it's not anything negative at all. even if you're experiencing a negative effect because of it. For instance, if you're an African American somewhere in America and you're experiencing oppression or racism because of your skin color, one way to look at that is in a negative light and to feel as if you're being beaten up on and picked on. And another way to look at it is to see it as your body of fate. That these are the elements that you cannot change. Who you are, how you look, and where you are in place and or time. And if any of those things bring about discomfort to you, then they are obstacles for you to overcome. They are not facts to make you a victim or to give you some sacred safe place in victimhood where you can talk about how people wronged you. That is not what those things are for. They are your body of fate. Whatever your fate may be, whatever the circumstances surrounding you that you cannot change, those are the things you must overcome. Those are the personal challenges that your life was gifted. And I say gifted because to overcome these challenges is no small feat. But what's more, there's no small reward on the other side. And now it's a bit hard for me to explain all the elements of Yeats' philosophy here in this talk. It's hard for me to even understand all of Yeats' philosophy, let alone explain it. But it is worth noting that these four elements, the will, the creative mind, the body of fate, the mask, putting the daemon aside for a second, these four elements work in conjunction on the great wheel. And the wheel is always chasing the mask. And so what I mean by that is whatever mask you choose, whatever ideal you wish to put on in your life, your will or your willpower is always chasing that mask, trying to embody it more fully, more honestly, more genuinely. And on the other side, your creative mind, or this memory bank of information, of countless past life experience, is always chasing the body of fate, or the facts of your external life, and the things that may be bringing you suffering now. The creative mind is always in search of it, in hopes of reconciling the disconnect and providing some ancient, long-standing, principled knowledge contained deep within your mind to you, so that you are better able to overcome the obstacles in your body of fate, so that you may fully achieve the person who you were meant to be.